Hi, everyone. Welcome to Thoughts for Change Makers LinkedIn Live. So, this is a space where we challenge the status quo, we elevate performance, and foster exponential growth. So, today I am with Dr. Rebecca Southern, and she's an insightful and high energy collaborative strategist and world class facilitator who has served as a trusted advisor to hundreds of mission-driven organizations across Canada and internationally. So Rebecca brings intellect, enthusiasm, and varied experience in strategy development and adaptability when speaking, writing, and mentoring. And she is a skilled communicator with a particular gift for helping leaders make wiser decisions faster. And she also is an author. She wrote 3 books. I did read Nimble. She wrote Sightline, and more recently, Elastic. Stretch without snapping or snapping back. And so that's what we're gonna talk today. We're gonna talk about maybe elastic and what does it take to continue to stretch productively without snapping back, or losing your shape. And before we start, I always like to ask a question about performance. So, Rebecca, welcome. What is your definition of team performance?
I think it's really important to figure out what success looks like for a team, and so that they know what optimal or high performance is. So that would be my first part of my definition, is that performance is directly related to whatever that team deems as successful. I think the other part that I would highlight is that people, sometimes it's called being fully self-expressed. When every team member can bring their full best contribution, their best self to their work, and have a really strong sense that that is contributing to a larger whole, and that in a sense the whole then becomes greater than the sum of the parts. And so I think having a clear definition of what a win looks like is the first part of performing well. And then the second part is being able to create an environment where people are bringing their very best, and that best, when combined with everybody else's best, is even better than those individual people would be alone.
Yeah, I love this metaphor of like you are the sum of everyone, and that is creating like a greater collective intelligence or like efforts, outcome, whatever. Thank you. So now tell me more about Elastic. Where does this idea come? Why the book title is Elastic?
Well, it comes from two places. It came from both a metaphor and an acronym. So the metaphor is of an elastic band. So if you can picture anything stretchy, I was really thinking about what it means to be able to continue to stretch. It was really came out of, our pandemic years of going, wow, people have really been stretched. And I was thinking about how that image speaks to what it has felt like to be things that are stretchy. They have a force, an outside force exerted on them that makes them stretch. And I think a lot of us felt for a long time like we had these external pressures, and are still maybe feeling that, where we have these external pressures that are pushing us into new shapes that feel unfamiliar. And yet, as time wore on, we were also unable to return to shapes that used to fit us. That they don't anymore. So we could dig into that metaphor more, but that was one place it came from, was this idea, just me playing with the image of what something elastic is like and how that applies to people. And then the second part was an acronym, because each of the letters in elastic represents a quality in leaders that I really admire, that I've found has been a bit either underrepresented, underwritten about, or has been written about in really sort of predictable ways. And it actually started with the idea of imagination. So the I in elastic stands for imagination. And I was very interested in the idea of various skills that we sometimes think of as individual pursuits as actually being more like team sports. When you were talking about team performance, that's part of my interest here, is to say sometimes some of the qualities that we think of as being personal are not only personal, they're actually collective. And imagination was the starting point for that, because I'm interested in collective imagining. So those were the two places. And gradually, as I began to think of some of the other qualities that I wanted to amplify, the third part of the book emerged, which is a series of case studies. What I notice when I read typical kind of leadership books is that they tend to highlight case studies and stories from the same small handful of usually American Silicon Valley
Yes.
companies.
I did notice the same. Yes.
Yeah, and most of my clients where I work and live wouldn't find those stories particularly relatable. And so I wanted to highlight the work of different kinds of organizations, mostly community-based ones that I work with that are working at really impactful scales, but they're not necessarily doing it with people whose names you'd recognize or across the world in necessarily that way, but are very place-based. And so the third part of the book is case studies of how these qualities of elastic leadership are showing up in real life. And so I've been delighted to highlight the work of 14 of the people and organizations that I've been privileged to work with, as partly a way of honoring them as I entered my 25th year of business, because the book was started around the time of my 25th year, and I figured I should do something to honor that. So there were lots of pieces that kind of led to the book being developed during COVID and ultimately being published earlier this year.
Yeah, I really like both. Like, it's well thought. Like this metaphor plus, the acronym, and with imagining. Can you talk a bit more about imagining as a collective? Is it coming from having different thinking style, different heuristic of life from all those individuals that are forming a team? Where does it come from for you? Like imagining, if you can share a bit more on this one.
I think where it started for me was I do a lot of strategy work, and I think sometimes strategy is based really heavily on past experience. So either what has literally experienced, what has happened in the past, and or maybe evidence, which is also usually data of things that have happened in the past, and very useful to have those. You wouldn't want to build your strategy without them, but they are both kind of rear view mirror, backward looking tools, aren't they? And so I was conscious of wanting to have something that, or a tool or a way of vocabulary, maybe, of describing how to help groups look ahead to where they wanted to end up, the kind of future they're trying to create together. And because some of the work that I do is in community building and placemaking and community development, it becomes really important as a facilitator to get out of people's heads what they mean when they use certain words and kind of put it on the table so that everyone can see it and say, when you say that, what do you mean? Do you mean this or this? Or, what are we actually going after? And it ties back into what I said about team performance. If we have a shared sense of what a win looks like, what success looks like, what we're all going after together, we are much more likely to be able to all move in the same direction to get that or to create that. And I find with collective imagination, it's a concept where if each person is imagining a different future in their heads, then they aren't necessarily all moving in the same direction. But even more than that, I think we don't take the time really to think in detail about what we want the future to look like. And it can veer into, those typical strategy sessions are all just sort of blue sky thinking. I actually think there's a place for that, to say, sketch in the details of the picture that's in your brain of what we're trying to build together. And I think when we get people talking about that, we realize that the image that's in your head and the image that's in my head or others around the table might not be the same as each other. When we might use the same few words, but when we add more words to it, we go, oh, actually we're going after different things. And it gives us a chance to build alignment so that we can be sure that we're all pursuing the same goal and not just using the same words for pursuing different goals.
I love it. That's so true. Like, using words mean different things for people. The same word means different things. And having sit down and having a vision and knowing where we go, but taking the time not to go from maybe our first picture we have in mind. Because as you mentioned, we can get bogged down in the past. And then I think it prevents us to really go in depth into what's possible for the future. And people, of course, they all are unique and bring a different perspective each time. And as well, I think, of elastic, and I think you mentioned it somewhere, that the world can be a bit disruptive. It's evolving fast. Like if we look at the 500 Fortune companies available now, I mean, still alive, if you look back at the 20 years ago, 25 years ago, you would see it's not the same names 25 years ago to now. So, and I think that that's what will be an edge for success of companies, is for them to really take control of their destiny and not to sleep and just go into their old pattern, because the world is very disruptive. And yeah, being flexible, maybe going back to the elastic, so we have to know, okay, what shape we can take to move forward.
Yeah.
And do you want to go into all the acronyms later? Like what are
Sure, why
do,
don't I
do
do
you
that
want?
first, and then I'd love to talk more about the metaphor too. But the acronym, the E stands for energy. And
Mhm.
I really believe that right now, energy is a very valuable currency. And if you think back to, what it feels like to be really deeply tired, right? People have come out of places and maybe are still in them where they were really exhausted. And I think it's because partly that we need to really gauge our own energy as leaders,
Mhm.
and also use that energy as a gauge for how other people are doing. Because I think energy can also be kind of a proxy for how people are doing more broadly. And so, really energizing people, energizing leaders, there's all kinds of evidence to suggest that positive energizers are people who help generate amazing results for the teams that they're on.
Mhm.
And so energy is one of them. The next
Mhm.
one is a bit of an interesting one in that it's likability. And I just about didn't
Mm.
include it. I didn't want to include it. I fought against it. Uh,
Mhm.
but the reason it's there is because I believe that leaders are people who are persuasive. And when you look at the literature on what makes leaders persuasive, what makes people want to follow someone, they follow people they like. And
Mm.
I resist it because there's a very there's some equity issues related to that. It's a very gendered
Mhm.
concept. I'd want to make sure that likability is not confused with niceness, for example, or that it's not a
Mhm.
plea for people to. We tend to like people who are like us, and so
Correct.
it doesn't really lead to diversity. And yet, what we find is that truly likable, long-term, deeply likable people, they really understand the importance of relational currency. And they also are people who have both competence and warmth. And so people um, don't tend to describe someone else as likable who doesn't have both of those things. So there's a depth of character and
Mhm.
some technical skill there. So likability is one. Adaptability is the A. I do a lot of work in assessing adaptability. We've got
Mhm.
I'm a coach for a tool called the adaptability quotient, and so we have good evidence on how to measure and get better at adaptability individually and as a team. So
Mhm.
I write about that. I mentioned being a strategist. So S is about strategy, and it's not about strategic planning per se, but it's about being a strategic thinker. And so that is really someone in my books who can take both the long and high view. So looking down that long road, looking
Mhm.
from a high altitude at the big picture of things, but can also link that big picture to the day-to-day
Mm.
work that people need to do. So they're not just staying in the clouds
Yeah.
and expecting people to understand that, but they can actually make
Mm.
a connection between that longer term, bigger picture vision and can see how all the pieces fit together, but they can also tell the story back to how your individual piece fits into that. So that's
Mm.
yes. So we have energy, likability, adaptability, and strategy. Then the T is trust. And trust, I again was kind of reluctant to include it because it is something that has been written about a lot. And it seems like high performing teams don't actually talk about trust that much because they don't need to. If teams are talking about trust, there's usually a trust problem. And yet the area of trust that I was interested in was the idea that extending trust makes you trusted. So we sometimes get the order wrong. We sometimes assume that someone needs to have earned our trust first. And
Mm.
actually, the people who are willing to extend trust and are willing to live in that space that has some risk attached, those are the ones, you think about a teacher or a parent or a coach or somebody that gave you responsibility before you'd earned it. Maybe a boss at a part-time job when you were younger or something. I know in my life when people did that, when they invited me to step up, I
Mm.
did. I wanted to impress them. I wanted to please them. It's the people that are expecting a lot of us that we want to perform well for. And so that
And you you felt safe to do so.
that's a big thing too. It's a really important part. And so trust is the T. I mentioned imagination already, and again from a individual and collective point of view, and learning how to embed imaginative thinking into corporations is a tricky thing. It's often seen as something children do or something people do when they're daydreaming alone on vacation, and so thinking about imagination as a skill, as a
Mm.
resource, Rob Hopkins writes about it as being a responsibility of people. And so I'm curious about that, which leads me to the C, which is curiosity. And
Mhm.
the area of curiosity that I'm interested in right now, two parts. One is that it is relational. And so what does it look like for curiosity to be building a relationship with someone else, not just extracting information from them? And then also curiosity as being not evenly distributed. There's a very strong correlation between privilege and curiosity, and I find that fascinating. Why is it that it's not just a temperament, personality trait or something? It's actually a skill that is valued in some situations and undervalued in others. But generally, most
Mhm.
cultures value it very highly, and it means that people of privilege who have had access to uh, a wide range of experiences, who have been parented in ways that taught excellent questioning skills. Those
Mm.
kinds of opportunities allow people to be more curious than they would otherwise be, and that gives them a leg up. When you look at all of the benefits of curiosity, it is just
Yeah.
mind blowing. All the ways that curiosity is good for us. So those are the seven. So I've been
Mm.
living kind of in the midst of all of that and then
Okay.
trying to figure out how those apply to this idea of being optimally stretched. And so that's where the metaphor comes back in to say these are some of the skills that we can bring to bear on making sure that we maintain some level of stretch, but not too much.
Wow. That's a lot. I give some space for people to go through that. And I love this curiosity aspect because what I was imagining is that the the elastic band in fact is expanding your horizon when you are curious, when you ask yourself questions you in your mind. But I guess the next phase is about taking action, and so it's expanding your mind, but as well like the possibilities, the options that you can take moving forward.
Absolutely.
Okay, I know you have some slides. Would you like to share some of them?
Gladly. Yeah, why don't we talk about the metaphor bit? Because I think that will help us dig into this a bit more because and think about how some of those things can actually um, be applied to this kind of language that we're talking about right at the moment. So I'm trying to get this available to us. There we go. Um, Perhaps you can help us have a look at those as well if they're not showing up for people. But if we think about, let's take something like as basic as an elastic band, but you can think about
Mhm.
anything that is stretchy. And one of the things that for me was I'm finding that this metaphor is really quite robust. I can think about it in lots of ways. Let's think about it first in terms of this diagram here. So if you think about just this rough shape, if I look at just one end of it, if we are stretched too much, either too, you can imagine with an elastic band, if we are
Mm.
stretched too hard, too fast, we break, right? But the other thing that can happen in being overstretched isn't so much that we break, but it could be that even with a band like this, you can be stretched out here for so long that you lose your stretchiness, right? You can stay in that position, but if you are if it let go again, it's kind of like, a bathing suit or a stretchy pant waistband, right? Where
Mm.
if you wear it stretched out for too long, it won't go back. And so overstretched can mean either that you've completely burnt out and literally are snapping, but it can also mean that you have been asked to stretch for too long, in that you have lost your elasticity in that sense. But the other extreme of that, if we look at the other way, is that you can be expected or expect yourself to snap back then into old ways of doing things. And this really showed up when people were sort of negotiating a return to the office kind of mode. But it can happen in lots of other relationships and times as well, where you can imagine in a relationship, for example, where if somebody's expecting you to behave the way you used to be,
Mm.
and you're feeling like you're being asked to be put back into a shape that no longer fits you. So if we go back to our metaphor, if this elastic has been stretched like this for a long time, like a really long time, and I let go of it, it will not go back to its original shape. And yet it might be that in our lives, we're being expected by people around us, or maybe by ourselves, to find our way back into old ways of being, ways of doing things that no longer suit us. And we need to find new scripts and ways of describing to people what it means for us to be resisting an old way that used to be fine with us, but is no longer. Um, and I think what can happen is that our tendency then can be just say, oh, forget it. Like, it's too hard to find the right balance between being overstretched and understretched, or snapping
Mm.
back, such that we stay kind of like just understretched, like an elastic just sitting on your desk. And the danger of that is twofold as well, because literally, if you are an elastic band sitting on somebody's kitchen counter or on their desk, you are not fulfilling the purpose for which you were intended. You're not holding things together. You're not doing the things that an elastic was supposed to do. You're just sitting there. So that's not amazing when it comes to purposeful living. But also, as I learned last summer, I was away from my desk for a long period of time. And when I came back and was talking to somebody about being stretchy, I pulled up that elastic that had been sitting on my desk all summer, and it literally snapped in my hand. It had become so brittle.
Correct. I had this experience too. Yeah.
Yeah. It
Mm.
it just it if we stay under challenged, under stretched, not
Mm.
fulfilling the purpose for which we are intended, we can actually become so rigid and brittle in those ways of being that we can't stretch anymore. So
Mm.
obviously, in the middle of all of this, I hope that there's a zone of kind of optimal stretch where
Mm.
we are pushing ourselves enough to be useful, to be challenged, to be agile, if I can put it that way, but
Mm.
not too long, not too fast, not in ways that no longer suit us. And one of the, I guess maybe two of the elements of the acronym, and I'll stop there for more questions, but two of the elements that really interest me when I think about the image of an elastic. One is that an elastic, in order to stretch, needs to anchor somewhere. You need to have some sort of fixed point from which to stretch, because otherwise it just kind of gets carried around, right? It needs to actually be fixed somewhere so that it can stretch. And I think part of this metaphor for me is helping my coaching clients, for example, and the leaders I work with, really identify what their fixed points are, whether that's organizationally, maybe anchoring to your values or your mission, or whether it's personally doing the same thing, to say, even as many other things are shifting and changing and uncertain and volatile, there are things that are anchor points for me from which I am safe and free to stretch. So that's one element of nuance to it that I really have appreciated. And the other maybe looks a bit like, I don't know if you've ever seen a toy that looks like this, but when we
Yes, I
think
have.
about stretching, we often use the expression, we're being stretched thin. And so if you can think of an elastic band, when I stretch it, it gets thinner, such
Mm.
that when stress happens, like if I were to put like a little nick in it, when it's stretched out like really tight, it would break. Whereas if I have a little bit of flex in it and put that same cut in the elastic, it doesn't break because it has some room. Even more so with a toy like this one, there are some materials in the world, and this is where the metaphor breaks down and where humans can learn to be more elastic, unlike physical materials, that when they are stretched, they don't stretch thin, they actually uncrumple and they become bigger. And their molecules line up into the purpose for which they're intended. And so one of the things that I've been playing with is this idea that that being stretched actually could mean that we are getting uncrumpled, right? That our folds and wrinkles and parts that are kind of underused or underexposed to the light are actually becoming more fully expressed. And so that's how I work with clients, is giving them some shared vocabulary around this, and also helping them to understand what it takes for them individually and on their teams to be living in that optimal stretch zone and not feeling like they are kind of outside of that, or that they're framing it in ways that are feeling life-giving to them and not constricting.
I love it. I can notice lots of thoughts that happened just behind like a simple object as an elastic. That's the first time I'm hearing that. So hopefully everyone watching this, you will see the depths of thoughts and insight that Rebecca is bringing around an elastic, and and how it's so well articulate about how we are moving through life, like with being overstretched, understretched, finding our optimal stretch zone in order to get to that nice shape where we can contain things and we can continually grow, because that's it. We are not fixed entities. Definitely, we grow, we evolve, we expand, but that's it. Sometimes we can lose ourselves in the expansion. So Rebecca, what will be your advice for people that, because most of the change makers out there, they are also high performer, and so they might tend towards more the overstretched zone in your slide. So if we talk to them more specifically, what could you say for them to realize maybe when they're overstretched, and then to go back into the optimal stretch? Like, do they have questions that they can go through in their mind to realize what's happening?
I mean, part of it, I think, is awareness. It starts with that, doesn't it? Of even noticing it. And I think sometimes when we have been stretched for too long, for too far, we become so used to it that we don't even notice that we are on the brink of burning out. And there's some very good resources, more and more actually being written around what burnout looks like, what it feels like, what to do about it. And I would draw people's attention to a couple of resources on that. One is that is a book called Burnout: Stopping the Stress Cycle. It's written by Amelia and Emily Nagoski. They're twins that wrote a really interesting book on burnout, and also Jennifer Moss's book called The Burnout Epidemic. Both of them talk about all different ways to combat burnout, but I think one of the big ways is paying attention to it in the first place. And one of the things that I learned in working through that acronym was that often the tips that people give in terms of how to get better at each of those things, they overlap, right? It's a very sort of messy ball of elastic bands. It's not individual things. And some of them sound so predictable. It's things like getting enough sleep and making sure that you're exercising and eating nutritious food and having fulfilling relationships and a sense of belonging. Like, it's things like that, but we can easily sort of nod at those things, but knowing them and doing them are not the same thing, are they? And so sometimes the strategies are not new strategies for us, but they are ones that we have to put into practice. And for me, one of the big ways that I recommend for people, particularly for overachieving type people that maybe have been stretched for a long time, is really to interrupt your patterns, to disrupt your routines and your habits. And even better would be to expose yourself to a variety of new experiences. So it's not just stopping the old ways, but starting the new ways. And for me, that can be something as simple as a change of scenery, whether that's a big deal vacation or whether it's a go for a walk in the middle of the day. But one of the things that as a facilitator, I missed the most during the lockdown phases of the pandemic was simply a change of scenery, a change of venue, because it changes our minds. It gives us a whole new perspective. It's like they say, if you normally walk your dog around the block this way, walk them the other way tomorrow, just notice houses you wouldn't have normally noticed because you're walking the other direction. And it can be in big deal ways or small ways, but I think that sort of wise pause and the interruption of your regular patterns, exposure to a range of ways of doing things, a range of ideas. It actually feeds a number of things. It doesn't just feed our, it's not just an antidote for burnout. It's also, it feeds our curiosity. It feeds our imagination. I remember seeing somebody's comment that you don't get curious or imagine what Paris is like if you've never heard of Paris or never been there, you know? And so people actually get more curious the more they're exposed to. And so sometimes when we are really operating at a really stretched place, we can't even imagine having any buffer or capacity to do anything different. So I think partly it is kind of stepping away from that pattern and just noticing what it feels like, not
Yes.
exactly the same thing. It doesn't have to be complicated, but it can actually be quite life-changing.
And what are the feelings that people can go through when they're in the optimal zone? How do they feel? What do they think? What do they see? Yeah, what are they experiencing?
I love, I mean, the common way of describing that is flow, isn't it? Where I think about examples where the time goes quickly, and at the end of whatever time you're in, you look up and you can't believe the time has passed so much, and you're not exhausted. You might be pleasantly tired, but you're not depleted, and that you have a sense that what you love, your skills, your gifts, what Marcus Buckingham would describe as your very specific loves have been put into use in that moment. And so I feel like when it's not easy necessarily, but there's a learning edge, there's an edge of challenge at the end of which you might feel tired. You probably need to rest, but you aren't necessarily worn out and depleted by it. And so I notice it when I'm in it, and I notice it when I'm out of it. The other thing I really notice when people are being optimally stretched is that there's an energy to that. I mentioned the importance of energy as a currency, that it actually energizes us. And we know from the research on adaptability that people who are learning to be adaptable they start to like it more. So it's not just that they are good at it. We all have to adapt. It's just a question of figuring out our easiest and preferred pathways to do it. But as you figure that out, you actually gain energy. People's satisfaction, people's gratitude, people's energy levels rise. And so I think really I mentioned using energy as a bit of a gauge for how you're doing. I think when we're in that optimal zone, our energy is high, we relate well to other people. I think we would have all experienced patches in the last little while where you didn't have to scratch too deep to find people who are a bit irritable, right? And I think when we've been stretched or over or under stretched, you can feel that you get a little grouchy, right? I mean, you get a little crunchy with other people. So I feel like there's a relational and team performance side of it, and an individual experience of knowing that you have stretched appropriately, but not for too long or too fast. There's also a pacing to that. One of the things that I love about the fact that we are people and not rubber bands is that we can learn this. It's not like, how, I don't know, we had 4 kids with braces on their teeth at one point where all 4 of them had them. And we had these little tiny little elastic.
Yes.
Yeah. They're little, right? They've got this tiny little capacity to stretch. And then you can have these big, rubber bands that are huge and they can do a lot. Or you can think about exercise bands or physio bands that you use to build their muscle strength. Each of those has a different capacity, but unlike those materials, humans can actually change the amount of flexibility that they have. And you can expand your skill set and your ability to be stretchy. And that to me is quite exciting because there's a learning journey here. And it's not a fixed, you're either a little elastic or you're a big one. You can actually get at this.
And as well, you can have this elasticity in different maybe areas of your life. In some area, maybe you don't want to overstretch. Maybe in some area, you will be intentional about the stretch. I can see that. And do you think it can become an addiction? Like if you have this adaptability and then you say, oh, then people once they discover that, then maybe they want more, and then they are looking for the thrill of like more adaptability. And could it be an addiction too?
Oh, interesting. I haven't thought about it like that. I can feel I mean, there's a certain level of endorphins that come into play
Mm,
when we're in a zone, right? When we are in
mm,
that kind of learning edge, but there's an excitement to that. And I could see that
yes.
the adrenaline of that could be
Mm,
quite intoxicating. And I think that um, I love what you said about different parts of our life, because I
mm,
think, if you think about, if I'm being pushed in one way and then I add another way and add another way, and all of a sudden the overall, I can't fit it all on my screen, but the overall stretch, of the elastic, when we take our whole life into account, that's the level of stretch that I'm interested in, because you can't just look at one area. It's kind of the
mm,
whole thing. And yet we do, we have to be careful of the stories we're telling ourselves, because we can
mm,
tell ourselves like, oh, I'm overstretched right now, or I can't take on one more thing. And
mm,
yet it's easy for kind of a fixed mindset to slip into that, right? And go, oh, I'm
mm.
this kind of person. I have this capacity. I really, I
Yeah,
can't take on anymore. I can't take on too much. And
yeah.
yet over time, as we learn, we can take on more. And I don't necessarily think it's
Mm,
infinite. I don't think it can happen instantaneously. But
mm,
I do encourage people to watch for where those sort of fixed beliefs can sneak in,
yeah.
because they aren't necessarily serving us well. Because unlike that little elastic band, we do have the capacity to learn
Mm,
skills that are going to help us expand more. And I would hope that as we learn that, it is kind of I don't know about an addiction, but it's absolutely compelling, right? I hope that we want more of that.
yeah, I mean, the question I ask it because I think I am addicted to adaptability and stretching myself
Oh,
in different. So that's why I was asking this one. And as maybe some people know, I also addicted to extreme sport. So that's why I'm kind of like looking for adrenaline in anything I do, whether it's intellectually or whether it's physically as well. So that's why
well,
I
I
was
did see
asking the
pictures of you skydiving, so that does not surprise me at all. Um, but it's true that I think some people are more wired to push themselves and maybe like have a tendency I think each of us has our own tendency, right? If I
question.
often talk about like that tightrope idea. If you're walking a tightrope,
Mhm.
balance is not a steady state. Balance is like, oh,
Mm,
a
it's
little too far
always
this way, a little too far that way. And I think
mm,
we have a tendency to lean one way or the other. And so that's where I think that little diagram I showed earlier,
mm,
if we can find where we are on that today, and also where
mm,
we tend to spend much of our time, it can just
mm,
act as a bit of a corrective, right? To help us get back more close to that optimal zone, because it really changes, and our life circumstances are that way. Sometimes we're going through really stressful patches where you just
mm,
are stretched because a lot's happening at once.
yeah.
But I think being able to pay attention to that, and
Mm,
not choosing repetitively to be in zones that are not healthy for us. And for some of us, that's overstretched. For some, it's under. For some, it's
mm,
agreeing to snap back into old ways of being, where
mm,
we aren't really being true to the newest, best version of ourselves, but we're going back into old patterns and habits that really are not serving us well anymore. So the idea of one of the elements of adaptability is unlearning,
mm,
and the ability to take ways of being that maybe once served us very well but don't anymore, is a particularly sort of advanced adaptability skill. And so I
yeah.
think staying away from that understretched or snapped back zone and pushing
Mm,
ourselves into those new areas, I think some of us are, as you said, kind of more into that than others.
correct. Now, last question. What would you like to leave the listeners with?
Mm. I think maybe I'll take it in a slightly different direction in terms
Mhm,
of what to leave you with, because I think when I go back to thinking about the structure of the book that I mentioned,
mhm,
the metaphor, the acronym, the case studies and stories, I think leaving people with an idea of, how do you prefer to absorb information in a way that sticks? Because for some of us, that metaphor will stick. And next time you see an elastic band, around your broccoli, you'll be like, oh, yeah. But for other people, they like the really sort of analytical, working your way through an acronym, and other people, they just want to hear stories. And so I think for all of us that are involved in maybe leading other people, being part of a team, and also the self-awareness that requires, I think really thinking about communicating things in multiple ways so as to reach people's preferences on that given day, in a variety of ways, and so that we're not insisting that people only absorb information in one way. And so I see that a lot in the facilitation work I do. I'm really big into variety and different types of activities to draw people in different ways. And I think this book is a bit like that too, to say, there are days, it may not even be different people who like different parts. It might be any of us on any given day might really resonate with the imagery of this, or we might be in the mood where we want a more analytical step-by-step treatment, or we just want to kind of meet someone through their story. So I hope that that's something people can take from this, is as you work with your teams, that you're communicating with them in a variety of ways so that we can meet them wherever people happen to be on that given day.
Love it. Yeah. So thank you, Rebecca. Thank you for joining us from Canada. I'm thrilled to have you as a guest, and looking forward. Would you write more books moving forward? Do you think it's something, because I know you have a book club. I mean, I don't know if you call it book club, but I know that regularly you read books, you invite people, and you talk about those books that you read. And in fact, you say 3 books, but I went on your website, you had 4 on your website. So the first one is not counting as a book?
No, I think because there was another book that I have contributed a chapter to, that was a series of colleagues, actually many of whom are based in Australia.
Okay.
And
That's
we worked together on a book called What the Hell Do We Do Now? It was an enterprise level guide to coping with some of the uncertainty through the pandemic. And it's interesting. I thank you for mentioning the book club. It's called Wiser by Choice. And what we do is I read a bunch of books and talk about them with leaders that don't read as much as they wish they had time for. And so we jokingly say that it's the book club where you don't have to read the books, because I read them for you. And then once you leave, if you decide to make it sound like you've now read them, that's on you. But at least you have a sense of whether they're worth reading or not. And I don't know if I will end up writing more books. I love, I like short form writing. I enjoy the blog that I write, for example, but I do find the long form writing a bit of a slog, and it's why I got out of academic life. I didn't stay there very long when I finished my graduate work, because I really didn't love the academic writing side. So it's interesting figuring out the kind of writing you most prefer. But certainly I'm never short of ideas, and so if books end up being the best way to get those out in the world, we'll give that a try. But getting that out in some other ways lately is probably more of interest at the moment.
Like this LinkedIn Live. So thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Rebecca. Bye for now.
I appreciate that, Lison. Bye-bye for now.